All right, Unit 1, Question 3. What effect did colonial experience have on the founders' views about rights and government? In what ways were 18th century American and British societies similar or dissimilar in terms of the rights of individual liberty, equality, and of opportunity and property? How did early state constitutions reflect colonial experiences as well as the ideas of classical republicanism and the natural rights philosophy? You may begin.
As stated in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal and granted certain unalienable rights. And when these rights are violated, it is the people's right to overthrow off such government and provide new guards for their future security. Colonial experiences called for revolution and the means to create representative governments in their state constitutions. These drew from both classical republican and natural rights philosophies.
Prior to the French and Indian War, the American colonies enjoyed a period of salutary neglect. Colonial assemblies were predominantly responsible for raising revenue for the good of the colony. They paid the salary of the governor, who would in turn favorably report back to the king. This system benefited the colonists and taught them self-rule. However, with the proclamation of 1763, the British imposed more authority over the colonial nobility, angering the merchants. Britain raised new taxes through the Stamp and Townshend Act on the colonies to pay back war debts. The colonies insisted, based on the ideas of Chapter 12 in the Magna Carta, that no scutage nor aid shall be imposed on our kingdom, unless by the common council of our kingdom.
Because the legislature has the most direct connection to the people, the founders were later granted the power to tax in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. The Sugar Act, a renewal of provisions of the Navigation Act, obstructed the expansion of the colonists' foreign markets. This detainment, furthered by the Tea Act, ignited colonial reproach. With Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, the founders granted the branch most closely associated to the people the power to regulate commerce, in order to avoid mimicking British policies.
Despite their very different experiences in the 18th century, American and British societies shared some of their basic ideas about rights. The colonists' ties to Great Britain instilled the idea that they shared the rights of Englishmen. Furthermore, the alignment afforded British and American colonial societies with new philosophies regarding individual liberties. The colonists, however, molded these with their own understanding.
For example, in the colonies, the parliamentary law of primogeniture was ignored. This permitted the population of landed white men to increase, which also increased the number of men allowed to vote for the members of the lower house and colonial legislatures. Because of this, the classes in the colonies were based on wealth and property, as opposed to birthright. The opportunity for religious liberty too increased in the colonies, due to the presence of various religions and the absence of the Anglican Church. All of these factors contributed to a greater degree of equality of opportunity than was seen in Great Britain.
State constitutions were drawn to ensure the unchecked power would not disturb the American people. Again, a Declaration of Rights was common in most state constitutions, as it reinstated fundamental rights and guaranteed freedom of the press and religion. These state constitutions later served as a model for the American Bill of Rights. In Lawrence v. Texas, the importance of specifying fundamental rights was carried into the 21st century. Ideas from the classical Republican philosophy appeared in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which stated that the government cannot continue to exist unless the morality of the people is perpetuated. Natural rights philosophy can also be found in this declaration through the first section stating that all men are by nature equally free and independent.
This same philosophy can be seen in the Massachusetts state constitution by having less property requirements as a means for receiving suffrage rights. In return, this gave more economic groups representation. In the early Pennsylvania Constitution, all citizens convicted had a right to trial by jury, which also encouraged the involvement of citizens in the public arena. This element of due process was later implemented in the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The lack of citizen attendance in juries today, however, has prompted California to push a bill allowing non-citizens to be members of the jury.
The colonists and their British counterparts were influenced by the same classical Republican and natural rights philosophies. Under British rule, however, colonists developed distinctly different views on the government's role in representing their constituents. Ultimately, though, the disagreement with British policy and ideals led the colonists to declare independence.
We're in 2013. should we have a constitutional convention to modernize the Constitution to get away from the colonial experience? Because many of our Bill of Rights, the second, the third, are based in colonial experiences, aren't necessarily applicable today in 2013.
Already there's a provision in the Constitution to allow for amendments to be passed. Jefferson once argued that the Constitution would need to be revised every 20 years. But with this provision, there's no need for that. We can make those changes but with the provision.
Yeah, but Daniela, we haven't had a true amendment added to the Constitution in 40 years. The 26th Amendment gave each the right to vote. Was the last true amendment proposed and ratified. The 27th was originally part of the Bill of Rights, and throwing that out the window. 40 years we've brought about a constitutional amendment. The amendment process doesn't seem to be something that is highly effective.
I think the fact that there has been such a long amount of time from the last amendment being placed in the Constitution shows that it is not necessary to have a constitutional convention because our system is working. The issues that come up that we would address in a constitutional convention, such as gun rights, gay rights, and other current issues, are being handled by the Supreme Court and the Congress and within states, legislatures, and governments themselves. A constitutional convention is not necessary.
I would like to disagree with what Elise is saying. The Constitution talks about slavery, and that's not something that is completely relevant to today. It's not it's not relevant at all. So I feel like we should have a constitutional convention which can deal with the problems that we have in our society today, rather than something that happened 200 years ago.
Going off Alexis, I actually do believe this also. The Constitution really was based off of these loose ideas that have been going around for over 200 years now. A lot of what has been said in the Constitution, like specifically the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, has a lot of different meanings, and different people in this country have different thoughts about what that law means and what that right to them actually stands for. And there's this big battle over gun rights and whether we should be allowed to have all type of guns or whether we should be allowed to have just certain type of guns. And I feel like if we had this constitutional convention, we could talk about this and what these rights actually mean, and we could make these amendments more applicable to the present instead of 200 years ago when we first ratified these amendments.
You say slavery is not an issue today. Is there not a lot of discussion going on about compensation for certain races that were involved in slavery? And how would that affect what we do through the Constitution?
But the fact that, like, when you bring up the compensation thing, that's also something that has to be, there needs to be a convention to talk about these problems that people are having with the current Constitution today.
What's that gonna get us? We all get in a room, we say, oh, it's unfair, I don't get compensation. What's that gonna get us?
Then we could try to rewrite and apply that to, like, those people's interests into a more current Constitution today.
So we just had a government shutdown. How do you think that's gonna happen with the functionality that we see in our government today over something like that?
We simply just need to elect Congress members that aren't going to stick to their partisanship. They need to do something that's good for the common good instead of just for their own re-election.
And going off that, in the Constitution it states there's actually two ways to propose amendments. One is by Congress, and the other is by a convention of states and state legislatures. And I don't think with the government shutdown, obviously, that these congressmen are fit to play this role because the partisanship has grown so much that we should allow the states to be able to propose these amendments and be able to talk among themselves, because they're definitely closer to the citizens than congressmen have become, and they're not as focused on politics and party lines and such things like that.
So you're saying we don't have party lines in the states?
We do, but I believe it's not as strong as it is in Congress anymore. It's not, oh, I'm focusing exactly to get reelected. It's not, I'm spending a year of my 2-year term on fundraising for my election and then going into that election process. I believe states have a better range of what they know. They know what their state wants, and they know that what this other states in the region want, and they can work together better.
So it would be better as a confederation then, instead of a federal system? Should we go back to, is that what you're saying?
I believe there should be a federal system. There should be a check of the national government as long with the state governments. But I think in this case, when they made the Constitution, there was a collection of states that came together, delegates from each state. And I believe if we just let it to Congress nationally, which is supposed to represent the national body, I feel like it wouldn't be as effective as if we let the states do it again.
One of the key things in your testimony was the idea of a declaration of rights. Almost, you said all or most state constitutions had them, yes? Why wasn't it included in the Constitution when it was originally drafted?
The founders believed that the rights that would appear in the Declaration of Rights were built into the Articles of the Constitution. That was the Federalist argument that a bill
Such as
of,
what?
such as the rights to freedom of religion.
Where's that?
That is in the part of the Constitution where Congress members are not required to take a religious text.
Article 6.
Yes.
Also in Article 1, Section 9, there is the right to habeas corpus, obviously, and that is something that protects human fundamental rights, and it's basically a guaranteed freedom of that right to habeas corpus.
Would you repeat the question one more time, please?
You guys focused on the idea that most state constitutions had some sort of Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights built into them. Why doesn't the Constitution have one in its original draft?
The founders also believed that the states would take care of these rights because they were already in the Declaration of Rights implemented in most state constitutions.
Have we seen any conflict to that today?
Absolutely. With the issue of the legalization of marijuana, in the federal government it's illegal, but in certain other state laws it is legal, even for recreational use, and that creates tension between the federal government and state governments. However, the federal government has elected to use federal preemption to see what the states and their citizens will do with the legalization of marijuana and how that will play out.
What has the federal government said it's going to do about Colorado and Washington? They're going to let it go. The Department of Justice says it's not going to use the Drug Enforcement Agency to prohibit any recreational use of marijuana in those states. Trying to make sure you know that. Go ahead, feedback.
You know, the thing I was impressed with is when we started doing some of the process questions, you took a stand and stood by it and addressed it. And, you know, that's what it's